Greetings. I am Nitish Mukhopadhyay, Professor of Statistics, University of Connecticut. Welcome to the proceedings for the 19th Pfizer Colloquium of the Department of Statistics at the University of Connecticut Stores. Since 1978, our partners in this project have been the Pfizer Global Research and Development, the American Statistical Association, and the Department of Statistics at the University of Connecticut at Stores. They have provided invaluable funding for this prestigious program. I remain grateful to them for the continued support. This funding has helped us to bring the most distinguished statistical scientists to our university. It has also allowed us to film the Pfizer Colloquium and a conversation for the archives of the American Statistical Association. Now I call upon my colleague, Professor Steve Coe of Columbia University, to take over the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Nitish. Dr. Chris Heyde is Professor of Statistics at both Columbia University in New York City and the Australian National University in Canberra. He is also Director of Center for Applied Probability at Columbia University. He has a very distinguished research career, and his research interests ranging from applied probability statistics to social sciences, history of statistics. He is a fellow of both Australian Academy of Science and of the Academy of Social Science. I believe he's probably the only member holding both membership. He has been Foundation Dean of School of Mathematical Sciences at Australian National University and the Foundational Director of Key Centre for Statistical Science in Melbourne. He has served as President of Bernoulli Society and Vice President of International Statistical Institute, and is Editor-in-Chief of international probabilistic journals such as Journal of Applied Probability and Advances in Applied Probability. He has been honored for his contribution to the Society by the award of Order of Australia in 2003 by the Government of Australia, for his contribution in research by the award of Pittman Medal, Hannah Medal, and Lewis Medal in 1995. So without further ado, let us welcome Professor Heyde.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much, Nitish. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to speak this afternoon. I'm going to give you a futuristic view which starts from some early history, which I'm going to link my own career into. Although the origins of statistics itself date back to the 17th century, the statistical profession essentially had its beginnings in the 20th century. The International Statistical Institute was founded in 1873, having been preceded by a number of international congresses. The first statistical societies had come a little earlier. The London Statistical Society began in 1834 and eventually became the Royal Statistical Society in 1887. The American Statistical Association, which was founded in Boston in 1839, is reputedly the second oldest professional association in the United States. But it required the creation of a new academic discipline to really launch statistics as a profession, and this was quite slow to crystallize. The first university department was created at University College London in 1911 with Carl Pearson as the head. But except for actuarial science and mathematical statistics, which was created at the University of Stockholm in 1929 with Harold Cremier as head, and the statistical laboratory, which was created at Iowa State University in 1933 with George W. Snedeker as head. Other departments were not created till after World War II. Then the floodgates opened. Columbia University and the University of North Carolina came in 1946 with their departments. Iowa State University became a full department in 1947, And then in 1948 there was Manchester University, Melbourne University, Stanford University, University of Cambridge Statistical Laboratory, and a rush followed after that. I began my training in 1957, and I'm old enough to have met most of the major figures in 20th century statistics. Indeed, I've met 16 of the 18 previous FISA lecturers, and I'm privileged to know quite a number of them very well. This has helped me greatly in understanding where our discipline is coming from, that historical perspective. For example, I heard Sir Ronald Fisher when I was still an undergraduate. At the time of his lecture, I was struck by the deference with which he was treated. And I sensed even then that there was more to that than just recognition of his eminence. People were frightened of him, basically. Later it was entirely clear to me why the critical questioning was avoided. I did hear of one ultimately quite distinguished statistician who was turned down for 3 chairs because he had worked in the same area as Sir Ronald Fisher for a while, and Fisher was not enjoying the competition. Anyway, having heard Fisher does seem to help in interpreting his quite unique style of statistical thinking and general unorthodoxy. So I'm going to go on from this history to talk about the decades one after another and mesh in my own sort of evolution in the discipline. So I'm going to the 50s and 60s now, once the departments were really going. And as I've indicated already, this was a hugely expansionary time. The tertiary education sector was developing widely, not just in statistics, but certainly in statistics. There were departments being created across the world. And at that time, statistics was acknowledged as an important discipline and a necessary component of any well-rounded education, whatever the discipline, so long as it had a quantitative basis. And service courses were generally taught by statisticians, and this fueled the growth of new statistics departments. It was a time of optimism, with jobs available for all newly trained people. Decision theory was a dominant topic of American statistics in those days. And it had a lot of promise at the time, but with the benefit of hindsight, I do feel that the subject didn't achieve nearly as much as we thought it was going to in the 1960s. The remnants seem to reside in such things as utility functions, which are much beloved of economists and econometricians. This was the area in which the era in which applied probability came of age. Serious developments of research in things like queuing and storage theory had begun in the 1950s. And initially the work appeared in standard statistical journals like the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society, Biometrica, the American Statistical Association. But with increasing submission numbers, editorial resistance hardened. The upshot of this was the creation of the Journal of Applied Probability by Joe Garney in 1964 as a focus for research in the area. I was a student with Joe Garney at the time the journals were created, so I saw it all happening and the difficulties of starting a new journal, even in those days. The journal subsequently has had a very profound influence, and it was followed by advances in applied probability, the new journal in 1969. That was a time when queuing theory was going through its first cycle of growth and decline. It's been through quite a number over the years. It was an era of considerable scientific excitement. I remember from my time as a graduate student, probabilists even conducting experiments, and my supervisor was spraying paint on ping pong balls through a small orifice to see how he could model the area on a molecule that a phage was going to have to attach to do some infectious diseases modeling. So I was very influenced by the broad spectrum of mathematical science topics that were being treated at the time, and it's made me have a broad appreciation of the sort of things that you can do with statistical modeling. Now I want to talk a little about the 1970s. The 70s saw a major revolution in science with the coming of the electronic computer. From its beginning with punch cards inputs, the evolution of the technology was rapid, and the computer has certainly changed completely the practice of statistics. It's also changed the facility with which scientists can collect and store data. The expansion of the 1960s continued on into the 1970s, but it leveled off before the end of the decade. By this time, far too many departments of statistics were teaching statistical theory and methods without any serious gesture towards applications. Danger sign. The growth of service courses began to slow, and later the demand for these courses began to decline. A general decline was evident before, certainly early in the 1980s, and it came as financial pressures on client departments began to make it disadvantageous to have statistics departments giving courses to their students. They wanted, indeed needed, the students and the money themselves. That was exacerbated by a widespread reluctance of statisticians to enter into a serious partnership with their client departments and to deteriorating levels of communication. In the 1950s and 60s, random walks received extensive studies, as did Markov processes. It was these things that I began to work on when I was doing my PhD. This was the time of the famous contributions of Spitzer and Polacek. Markov processes represented the first tentative step outside the independence context. The 1970s brought much more in terms of dependent variable results, and in particular a collection of powerful limit theorems for martingales, which completely subsumed the corresponding ones for independent random variables. This led on to a general theory of inference for stochastic processes with a powerful blend of results from both probability and statistics, and I was very much involved in that, and also for the important role that martingales play in time series analysis, because of results like the one that says the best linear predictor is the best predictor if and only if the innovations are martingale differences. And what that means, if you take the jargon away, is that you'd use a linear model if you've got martingale difference innovations, and if you don't, you would try to find a good nonlinear model rather than to use a linear one. So this spurred efforts to develop nonlinear theory, and that came with the beginning of the 1980s. So now something about the 1980s and 90s. The loss of service courses, which began in the 1970s, turned into a widespread shrinkage of departments in the 1980s and 90s. By the end of the period, there had been many absorptions and closures of departments, even ones with highly distinguished histories. Every small department was vulnerable, especially at the time of departure of a major figure. Three of our Ivy League universities were involved at this time with troubles over possible closures, and Princeton did close after John Tukey retired, and Columbia and Yale nearly closed. Columbia after Robbins got to the end of his time, and Yale with Jimmy Savage going. This was a period in which there were new methodologies developed which wouldn't have been practicable without the computer revolution. Things like the bootstrap and the proportional hazards model. It was the computing power that made these things practical, possible, and ultimately very influential. But it's also interesting to note over periods of something like 30 years that many topics have remained popular, even popular in applied probability, despite a distinct shortage of real applications. Branching process is one of them. And this seems to be a reflection of the fact that many of us are mathematicians at heart, and we don't altogether take too much notice of what the business is useful for if it's an interesting model and it produces nice mathematics. But there are lots of other areas that one might tar with the same brush, and percolation, particle systems, properties of Brownian motion, many things which haven't necessarily had very many spin-offs, or if they have, the spin-offs have come early, and the theory has been developed largely for its own sake. Branching processes, of course, came from practical applications. It came from the original problem of seeing when a family name was likely to go extinct. As the aristocratic families in 18th century Europe were very conscious of passing on the family assets from father to son, and they were worried about whether or not they were going to be able to sustain the family name. And studies showed that the average time for a family to die out was about 300 years, and people were concerned about this and tried to model it. So that was where the initial theory in branching processes came from, and then the physicists took it up to study cosmic ray showers. So it had its practical origins, but then it turned itself into mathematics. But this was the era of separation of probability and statistics, at least in the United States. As far as I'm aware, the National Science Foundation is the only funding agency internationally which applies this separation, and the ramifications are significant. Probability is hardly within the orbit of the American Statistical Association now, and IMS now essentially treats probability and statistics as distinct. Teaching in the USA is often done separately. So typical of the consequences can be that statistics PhDs might only know the central limit theorem for independent random variables, and not, for example, the corresponding results for martingales, because martingales are in the domain of the probabilists in the United States. But these tools are needed for a wide range of dependent variable contexts, and they're becoming increasingly important. They're also essential for a general treatment of likelihood. And many papers are being written with asymptotic estimation results which can be made much broader with little or no additional cost. At present, these results are often being reinvented and extended by engineers and econometricians, and the statistical profession is the loser. I think an integrated mix of probability and statistics is the right way to go, and certainly in some countries it's done very well. I would commend, for example, the basis of the training in a place like Denmark for the mix of probability and statistics. Now I'm going to talk about some personal experiences. I'm going to begin with some comments on my experience as an editor. And as Steve mentioned, I've been editing the Journal of Applied Probability and Advances in Applied Probability for what is nearly 16 years now. And before that, I edited stochastic processes and their applications for 5 years. And before that, various other things, including the Australian Journal of Statistics. I want to emphasize the importance of communication skills, because this is something that authors in general are not very strong with. And perhaps my strongest impression as an editor is of many unskilled authors, many having received no more than a little ad hoc advice from supervisors on how to write research papers, perhaps none at all. It's common for authors to have little sense of the need to write in a way which markets their research. They don't understand that they have to put their key ideas up front in the paper, and they have to relate what they have done very clearly to what is done already with the existing literature. And many young authors don't appreciate that the writing style of a thesis or a monograph, which is quite leisurely and didactic, is different from that of a research paper, which emphasizes conciseness and makes less concessions to the presumed knowledge of the reader. But it's by no means only the young and experienced that are at fault. Many experienced authors don't take the time to prepare their papers thoroughly. Of course, we're all under great pressure and we have limited time, and there are still these publish or perish principles that are very evident. Now I'm going to pass on to some observations about my experience as a consultant and as a supervisor of consulting. Consulting is a skill best developed through apprenticeship. Universities, by and large, don't do a good job in ensuring that their graduates are adequately equipped with these skills. And most industry careers obviously involve consulting. Bridging the gap between the theoretical models that we teach in our courses and real data is a significant challenge for most students, and they need help. I've found that the use of instructional videos, for example, to illustrate role-playing, to deal with difficult clients and things like that, to be very helpful. Of course, communication skills are a priority, and they can certainly be a significant obstacle for students from non-English speaking backgrounds. I think that most universities would do well to institute something that you could call a professional practice course that all people get before they graduate, maybe given by a wise elder statesman who would give general advice on how to deal with what you're going to find in the outside world. It was in the early 1990s that I began my dual life with basically half a year in the United States and half a year in Australia each year. I had completed a term as Foundation Dean of what is now the Mathematical Sciences Institute at the Australian National University. And the infancy of the school had been a difficult one. I was much attracted by the support for new developments at Columbia, certainly the support for the creation and operation of the Centre for Applied Probability. Of course, I was later to have some negative experiences in the United States, but generally I've found it more entrepreneurial than in Australia. The circumstances that I've met over the years, of course, have had many positives and negatives, and it's the positive experiences that I would wish to remember. I recall with great gratitude, for example, my dealings with the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne when I went there as head of department. He gave me extra positions to fill. He followed my advice on the setting up of a consulting centre. I asked for money to furnish a suite of offices to commercial standards so that people coming in from the city, from a commercial environment, would not feel they were going into a university slum. And he also provided the funds for a director, and I had said to him that if we funded a director, then we were going to be able to generate enough revenue from the centre to operate at a good standard. And this we've managed to do, and it's still going over 20 years later and very successful. These things are very stimulating for a department, and the introduction of the consulting centre did change the topics of conversation around the morning coffee table from what had happened in the sport overnight to what had come into the consulting centre, which was pretty healthy for the department. Okay, well, as for the negative experiences, well, the less said about those, the better. I'm going to talk now about the current situation. Financial pressures are now inescapable. Most of the world's universities are funded directly by governments, and the percentages of the operating funds which come from government sources has been in steep decline. Institutions which in the 1970s received about 90% of their funds from government now typically receive more like 30% of their funds. A recent New York Times article gave the current figure for the University of Michigan, which is a good research university, at only 18%. It's hardly a state university with so little funding. So a consequence has been the need to fill classrooms with fee-paying students. In addition, soft money has become a major component of budgets, with the attendant need to compete for research funds from which our institutions can levy substantial overheads. Having spent most of my working life in organisations where research funding was provided by the institution of employment and outside sources of competitive funding were not available, that was Australian National University Institute and CSIRO, this has made me acutely conscious of the changes and the fact that the working conditions which I had are history. We must be aware of the possible future if the statistical profession maintains its current attitudes and practices. Just as companies can find their lifespans limited if their business model becomes obsolete, similar fates can befall industries and professions. We don't want to be left behind like the coach builders of the horse and buggy era. But at a superficial look, statistics is thriving as a profession. The American Statistical Association's got about 17,500 members and 21 special interest sections. Royal Statistical Society's got 6,300 members, including a professionally accredited membership of some 1,500. The societies, national and international, have an ever-expanding list of programs reflecting the increasing importance of applications. And there's no shortage of jobs for statisticians. There's a shortage of statisticians for jobs. Demand for new recruits is considerable in areas like the pharmaceutical industry. But if one looks at membership over time, the societies are pretty static, save for the special case of the International Statistical Institute, which I'm going to say something about shortly. The Royal Statistical Society has been declining slowly in recent times. Its last big jump in membership was in the 1970s, when it grew by 20%, but since then it's been static or in decline. The American Statistical Association has increased its membership by a little over 10% in the last 20 years, which is very small given the number of PhD graduates that are produced every year. Statistical societies elsewhere have had roughly comparable experiences. For example, the membership of the Statistical Society of Australia peaked at 735 in 1973. 5 years later it had slipped to 650 and it stayed at about that level subsequently. Whether these membership numbers are in line with a general downturn in community participation in organisations is something of an open question. There is a book by R.D. Putnam, published in 2000, with the title Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of the American Community, which discusses this decreased involvement. But certainly the societies need to maintain their vitality and integrity of purpose and to avoid excessive fragmentation. The trouble is many of our new graduates are just not joining. There are at least 200 new PhD graduates each year coming out in the United States, and only tiny numbers are joining the societies. Aging of the societies is another issue. For example, the International Statistical Institute had its median age of members at 55 in 1996. And 4 years later it had grown to 59. 4 years, it had gone up 4 years. It was pretty dramatic. And something more than 10% of the newly elected members are resigning after 3 or 4 years of membership. So this does suggest that somehow we're not providing the members with quite what they're looking for. We have the scary figures, which I give in Table 1, that between 1996 and 2000, the percentage of members over 60 has gone up more than 10%, from 34% to 45%. Over 50, it's gone up more than 10%, from 72% to 84%. And the numbers below 50 have gone down more than 10%, from 28% to 16.5%. These are not encouraging, and it would be instructive to examine the age profiles for other societies and make a general assessment of their health. Another useful measure of activity is the number of papers and books that are coming out, and current index to statistics gives us a good idea of this. There was a very rapid growth in the 1970s, but the numbers have levelled out at about 8,500 to 9,000 a year. This is coming from a list of core journals, which is about 110 in number, and expanding at the rate of about 2 a year. Then roughly 400 non-core journals and 1,500 edited books and proceedings. What is happening is, as more and more applications come into the picture, there's a hollowing out of the contributions to the methodology of the subject. That's been declining as other things grow. It's instructive to look at the case of data mining. This is a major growth area whose importance for statistics is underappreciated. The subject is conceived as multidisciplinary and involving machine learning, database technology, statistics, expert systems, and visualization. But current index to statistics, which first recorded the title in 1996 and then flagged the subject with a heading for the first time in 1997, listed 17 papers then, and this came about through the creation of a new journal called Data Mining and Knowledge Discovery, published by Kluwer, with 4 issues a year. As of late April 2002, the current index to statistics database showed up 93 articles in data mining, whereas looking at Ingenta Search, the website, showed up well, the last time I looked at it was October 2005, and current index to statistics listed 228 articles, and Ingenta listed 2,375. So the statistics literature is picking up 10% of what there really is. So it's clear enough that statistics is not embracing data mining, even though a few departments are taking it seriously. But it does represent a new niche market that's apparently being missed by the statistics community. And it's a niche market for which there's a lot of publicity. I mean, there was a very nice article in New York Times a few weeks ago indicating the potential of the area. We're also, to some extent, missing out in areas like bioinformatics, even though many more statisticians are taking a serious research interest in the subject. Perceptive professionals can perceive the trends before they show up in the literature, and so by and large can the students. The striking growth of mathematical finance has largely been fueled by student demand. Many faculty who were drafted into teaching courses in the area have subsequently developed a corresponding research interest. The slow growth of the literature does mark what is actually quite a decline in submissions to the key journals. This is offset by creation of new journals, but it's interesting to note that journals like the Annals of Statistics, the Annals of Probability, Annals of Applied Probability, Journal of Applied Probability, Advances in Applied Probability, have all had their submissions decline 30% over 10 years. This is offset by the new journals and the specialist journals that are coming on stream. And while the sales, while the submissions are slipping to the journals, the sales are also slipping. This is partly coming about because these things are increasingly online and people are accessing them through their home institution and not subscribing themselves. So the 200 new PhDs a year, by and large, are not signing up for these things. They're not subscribing to the journals. They're not joining the societies, and this is something we have to worry about. Now I want to talk some more about the future of university statistics. Most research funding in statistics across the world goes to the university sector. This sector faces a particular difficulty in dealing with cross-disciplinary and multidisciplinary areas. The usual structures of departments and schools built around traditional disciplines are commonly defended much like baronial empires are. It's humanly understandable, but entirely the wrong response in this era of networking and the internet. And universities need new organisational models to cope. Competition for research funds is producing change, and student demand is producing change. Providing high-quality degrees in areas such as bioinformatics requires unprecedented levels of cross-campus cooperation, and we don't generally have a good record at that. It's my feeling that statistics may need to be recast into a broader disciplinary setting. The autonomous university statistics department, as we know it, could easily disappear in the foreseeable future. But at the same time, there'll be an increase in the number and diversity of university programs that have a serious statistical component. There's also the issue of biostatistics departments, which face a substantially different set of challenges. So I'm not commenting on those directly. The amount of statistical work being done by those who don't identify with the profession is hugely greater than by those who do identify with the profession. But the integrity of the profession can't be sustained by a diverse collection of applications in the absence of adequate attention to the methodological core. So we need the continuing development of deep and broadly applicable results. Well, when I joined academia 40 years ago, it was an expansionary time. Statistics had come of age. But over the intervening years, the report card hasn't been all that good. We've, in many cases, failed to provide client departments with what they wanted, and we've lost many of the service courses that we used to teach. And now any department which slips below a faculty of 10 to 12 is especially vulnerable. Some departments have escaped, for example, through fortuitous location or institutional prestige or niche marketing, but these are difficult times, and our mathematical traditions can be something of a handicap. There's still a tendency to teach statistics as a deductive discipline, but questioning of premises is vital for practical applications. We also often fail to provide courses in classical areas where they have widespread use, such things as sample surveys. Reasons of taste can outweigh marketing logic. All disciplines now find themselves in a market-driven environment. Internationally, there's been a significant decline in student numbers in the physical sciences. Mathematical sciences has also been significantly affected, but not as much as physics and chemistry. Some universities have closed physics departments. There are 3 in the UK that I know about. And there is no guaranteed core anymore. The first private university in Australia closed, I mean sold, its whole science faculty. And statistics departments will need to make their choices in a very competitive environment. I think that the universities which will do really well in future are the ones who are quick to react and to act. A long history that may extend back over the centuries and vestiges of a collegial atmosphere of consensus and consultation can provide a significant impediment to progress. But on the other hand, the other side of the coin, managerialism does bring with it a multitude of dangers, even in a system with a pretty high degree of accountability. I'd like to think that statistics can maintain its traditional strengths and add to them with optional courses differing from institution to institution in reflection of the important applications as they become visible. And of course taking account of interests and expertise of the faculty. Universities have responded very well to the emerging niche market in quantitative finance. We can, in principle, respond well to other opportunities. I see opportunities in risk management, insurance risk, and related issues. But these things are not painless for departments against a background where staff numbers are often declining, and one has to take the plunge and offer the new courses and hope that the student numbers will build up and the payoff can be harvested. Of course, adjuncts can be enlisted as part of the process. Finally, I want to say something about historical roots and possible transformation. Our tradition is largely that of inference based on probabilistic models, which places us squarely in the mathematical sciences. We've never sought a broad role in information sciences, and even less in information technology. Computing has been a rather incidental statistical tool. But now much data is automatically recorded, and there's no shortage of contexts where there are really no limitations on sample size. We can prove that any model we might want to propose doesn't fit the data if we have enough data. If one's studying network traffic, 50,000 observations is no problem. It's inevitable that fields such as database management have evolved, and by default probably rather than design, the statistical profession didn't seek to embrace such things. The rationalizations are clear. The subjects are fundamentally non-stochastic. It can be thought of as technical rather than scientific, etc., etc. Plenty of excuses. But the attitude has been marginalizing the statistical profession in the marketplace, both the commercial marketplace and, as a consequence, the academic marketplace. And there's no doubt in my mind that we're becoming less influential, that other data-oriented sciences are taking customers, students, and jobs away from us. I see this very clearly at Columbia University, where I think my principal role is that of Director of the Center for Applied Probability, which is a cross-campus, cross-disciplinary initiative concerned with chance and risk in all their manifestations. We have about 25 faculty across 10 university departments associated with the centre, and I find that my closest colleagues are based in disciplines outside mathematics and statistics. They're in engineering schools and business schools typically, and they do probability and statistics under these other auspices. They have limited identification with the statistical profession, even though they've often been trained in statistics departments. People like this can do a huge amount in terms of links to kindred disciplines for us, but the links tend to be a little bit tenuous. Half the postdocs that the Centre for Applied Probabilities had have come from mathematics and statistics departments, and they've rebadged themselves into quantitative finance and gone off to do that sort of thing, ultimately to do things like working for hedge funds. So we're really losing them to the statistical profession. The term statistics has negative social connotations, unfortunately. So there may be a case for trying to reinvent or reinvigorate the subject under a new name with a rather better image. We need to suggest a broader spectrum of activity than hitherto, but of course we've got to be prepared to embrace the broader spectrum of activity. I don't really have a good name to suggest, but statistical sciences is better than statistics. We need to embrace uncertainty, risk and chance as well as statistics. Maybe a new word in the spirit of stochastic might be created. I think data should be kept out of the title. What we do is science, it's not technology. One difficulty is that any prospective title is likely to have other players involved, and they will undoubtedly want to defend their perceived territory, and perhaps partnerships or amalgamations might be the only way forward. I think there are precedents for this, such as the merger of the Operations Research Society and the Institute of Management Science that took place in 1994-95. In summary, I think these have been interesting times and we have many challenges ahead of us. I hope that in the busy lives we can lead, the statistical profession has enough wisdom to chart the course forward carefully and to ensure the integrity of the future for the discipline. So I'm going to finish at this point. Thank you for your attention, and I want to offer my word of thanks to the sponsors, to Pfizer, to the American Statistical Association, to the University of Connecticut, Department of Statistics, STORS. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, for a wonderfully stimulating lecture. Thank you, Steve, and thank you all.